welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. Every week there seems to be mention of a new trust framework. People are really trying to monetize them. But to understand trust frameworks, let's first understand what constitutes trust. We must define concepts such as levels of assurances and what defines technical versus human trust. And once this is better understood, the conversation about where organizations fit into digital identity ecosystems is much simpler. And note, in this new paradigm, organizations no longer need to be at the center of the universe. So in this conversation, I have the pleasure of welcoming Bouma and Darrell O'Donnell, two proud Canadians promoting the adoption of self-sovereign identity. Tim is a senior policy analyst for identity management at the Treasury Board Secretariat of the Government of Canada. Darrell is a technology company founder, executive, investor, and advisor who is on a mission to help organizations build and deploy real-world decentralized SSI solutions. Now, this conversation was really amazing. Both Tim and Darrell have been in the space for many years and have put so much thought into what is being talked about here today. And it's really clear why, when you talk to folks like this, why Canada is taking a leadership position in the whole digital identity space. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Tim and Darrell called The Battle of the Trust Frameworks. Enjoy. Okay, so this conversation today, we're going to talk a lot about trust. And I think what we're all trying to do in different ways is create digital trust through stuff like digital sovereignty, governance, or various frameworks. One of the things that we hear a lot about, but I think there's maybe not enough knowledge generally about, is levels of assurance. And I just want to talk about how levels of assurance kind of plays into trust. And just to start off, Darrell, it would be good to just give the audience here maybe an introduction of levels of assurance as they relate to identity assurance and why it's important in what we're doing and trying to enable digital trust.
Perfect. I'll point at two examples on this, Mathieu. One is down in the States, NIST, National Information Science Technology, whatever their standards body, has a pretty detailed but very technical set of criteria for various different what's called assurance levels. One is for the credential itself. So they have all these different things. If you're a technical person, you can dive in and kind of understand and see how they interact. What I've been noting is in the more operational business world, when people are trying to figure out what does this mean in my trust world, not just the technical trust, that the one that people are looking at and getting a lot of value from is what's called, it's now part of a Canadian standard out of the CIO Strategy Council, but it was really started out of the public sector of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which Tim has been working on amongst a bunch of other real solid government folks who've been getting some advice from industry. The business rules there are basically, level 1 means you have an identity, but I don't know if I can trust it effectively. Level 3s and level 4 are getting into the real serious levels of trust. When do I want to do banking? I would say, given the numbers, that's a 3. It's just kind of what's the consequence of not knowing it really is you that changes the equation of how I'm going to know whether I want to do business or just, chat with you type of thing, depending on what I'm doing. Tim probably has a far better and deeper explanation that covers the kind of the detail behind that. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say, trust is very subjective, and assurance levels, interpretation of assurance levels is very subjective, which is fine, and you're never going to get away from that. But when you start codifying this into policy instruments, you have to be very, very specific and unequivocal in your definitions. And we've been doing that for more than a decade. And really the buck stops from the federal standpoint from our Treasury Board standards, namely the Directive on Identity Management, the Standard on Identity Credential Assurance. And we have very specific definitions in there. They're very narrow in some respect, but they're very specific definitions. And then based on that, we actually have an assessment framework for determining looking at the potential levels of harm to determine what level of assurance that you need. So at its very essence, level 1 is little confidence, level 2 is some confidence, level 3 is high confidence, level 4 is very high confidence. And then that gets applied to identity, making sure it's the right person. And then we apply that to credential, which is, are you holding the credential that was issued to you and you haven't compromised it? And then with our 2019 directive, we added in like assurance levels for trusted digital identities, which is level 1 through 4. And the definitions, you can find them on our website. They're actually very narrow, subject to interpretation, but that's okay. And then we have like an assurance level assessment tool that departments and agencies go through. And practically speaking, the practice that's developed over the years is that, I think what Darrell said, level 1, you don't really care. There's not much on the line. Level 2, it's like, okay, there's some inconvenience, so on and so forth. Level 3 is when you start having serious consequences, financial or, stuff that's like high impact, but reversible. You can actually repair the damage. And when you get in a level 4, it's another realm entirely. That's when you're talking like disorder, death, etc. And rarely do we ever get into that level with the work that we're doing. And at the end of the day, it's just a way to communicate like what is your potential risk acceptance. And keep in mind, it's different than an assurance level. The way we've defined assurance level is that when something happens, when you issue a passport, when it gets compromised, when you have a login system, when it gets compromised. It's not how that's different than risk, which risk is like impact times likelihood. We actually factor out the notion of likelihood. So there's a lot of nuances, Eric. We could probably spend the whole podcast talking about this, but we have quite a detailed and precise framework. It's a Canadian framework. You talked about NIST. We do have some differences. They went to 3 levels and we remained at 4. The reason being is that we needed that extra gradation between what I would call the services that require high confidence versus the ones that have some confidence. And basically that leap between level 2 and level 3 typically requires like a quantum leap in terms of investment and controls. And we didn't think it was good to smash those 2 things together. So I'll leave it at that. I can talk for quite a while on this, but at the end of the day, we have policy instruments that backstop the concepts that we can use to interpret for our purposes.
And I think I would add, Mathieu and Tim, the key thing I think that we need to understand is that if I have a very high confidence and assurance in a particular credential, but I'm holding it in a digital wallet that's not trusted, has a low level of assurance, that introduces a problem. We can only be as strong as that weakest link. So when we get into like the digital wallet realm, which impacts trust, do I trust? The joking one I use is, can I trust Bubba's wallet, which is that awesome user experience, best #1 rated app in the App Store, but it's built by North Korea. This is one of the areas where we have to make sure that assurance is in the all of the pieces, because otherwise there is a lack of assurance there.
Yeah, and if I can add, like we've put in our guidance, we have very detailed guidance that we talk about. There's actually 2 sides to an assurance level. There's the one of what you actually need to carry out your program, and then the other side is what are the controls that you need to put in place to actually achieve the assurance level. A lot of times everybody's focusing on the controls needed to achieve, and really just assume that the business owner knows what level that they need. But they're 2 very different things, and they come together with the assurance levels. To Darrell's point, like we have guidance. It's written a number of years back, but we looked at adding in what we called compensating factors, additional safeguards, etc., like downstream from the authentication event. And what Darrell is speaking about is, I would say, almost like additional threat vectors that can come into the equation. And you just have to take that into account. I would say we haven't written any specific guidance to that effect because we've viewed with the functionality of the wallet being inside the program being implemented, but now it's actually being outside, so therefore you have to trust it. So that's something that we need to look at. But fundamentally, it doesn't change the model. It just changes what controls you implement and which controls you trust.
So then, if we look at the levels of assurance, really, and describing it as helping you with your controls and helping you manage your risks so that you could engage in interactions or engage in trusted interactions. If this is kind of an enabler for trust, and maybe it's a good kind of segue to lead into the concept of trust, and just defining what trust is. And I think traditionally, I guess at a human level, not talking digital, but just at a human level. For example, I've done business with Darrell before because I've met Darrell. I've spoken to him enough times to know he's trustworthy. I've seen what he's able to do. And I don't necessarily know if there's like a direct formula or anything for me to have this kind of trust form between us. I guess it's a mix of just personal experience and just my personal assessment of things. But now when we're talking more about digital trust, how does this kind of process that I just described here translate to digital? And for example, I'm able to do business with Darrell in the physical world or offline or however we call it, just because we have that personal trust. But how do I do business with another person or another company that I don't know at all? How could I form a relationship and start interactions without having gone through that process that Darrell and I have gone through? And then at the same time, as we are talking about digital trust, there's maybe some components of based on, I think the listeners of this podcast understand quite well kind of what the verifiable credential triangle, or however we want to call that trust triangle, and the different roles in digital interactions being issuers, holders, and verifiers, how to trust each party in here. So maybe just taking it a step back, and I kind of threw a lot here, and I'll throw it to either one of you, Tim or Darrell, whoever wants to jump in. But now that we've kind of covered what levels of assurance is and how that helps us reduce risk to hopefully build trust, how would you then describe trust?
I was just reading an article today in the Ottawa or CBC that someone rented a house and didn't realize that it wasn't the house. The person who rented it, it wasn't their house. The people who owned it came in a week later and found a tenant. You have a breakdown of trust in the physical world, but it was all conducted digitally. The problem we have is a couple of things. If you take the hold of what we call the trust triangle, where you have an issuer, let's imagine it's a driver's license, just to get down to something really simple. It's a terrible example to use, but it's helpful. Where you have a government issuing a driver's license in a trusted, high assurance way to me. And then I'm going to use that later to go to the bank to prove my identity in some other way. This is great because you know you can trust the government, but how do you know in a digital world that it's actually the government? How do you know it's not? Because I'll tell you this, and I've joked about this a lot. If digital had been where it was when I was in high school, I would have been the slowest province, and I would have been issuing digital driver's licenses so people could get into the bars. You know, would have been 10, 20, 25 bucks with or without inflation. But you need to have what's called we're starting to call it the trust diamond, where you have to have a trust registry that says, here are the bona fide issuers, the authorized issuers, authoritative issuers of driver's licenses, or of, property registries, or whatever it is. But similarly, you want to know that if I'm handing my driver's license over to someone, is that verifier trusted? Are they going to follow the rules of the game? They're just checking my age majority. They need a low-res photo, and are you over 18, 19, or 21, depending on where you are. That piece is really hard. And each piece of those needs to have, the pieces that are one of assurance that it is actually my driver's license. I haven't done a digital copy and given it to someone who looks like me. But that trust registry side, we did a webinar just a few weeks back. We've actually been asked to give it a few more times internally to some folks to understand, what does it mean? Because if I have a closed network like MasterCard or Amex or Visa, I know exactly who the issuers are because they're part of that old school PKI approach, and it works. What starts to fall down is when you have different players involved in different networks and you're not bridging them all. So it's hard, but we're seeing the patterns repeat. People have been trusting credit cards for decades. It's a similar pattern. It just was never feasible before we got to this decentralized identity side of things.
I divide the problem into two very distinct domains to solve. One I like to call the technical trust issue, and the other one is the institutional or human trust issue. And a lot of times those things get conflated. When I say technical trust, this is where I see things like verifiable credentials and the supporting infrastructures like solving that problem. From my point of view, government, we want to focus on the institutional trust, making sure that the driver's license is actually legitimate in the first place, so that passport is legitimate in the first place, that we have the right person, it's the right holder, etc. But then make it very clear that the technology carries the trust from that point on, whether it's like a like a physical passport or digital rendition. So what's very, very attractive about the verifiable credentials is it helps solve the technical trust problem. It introduces a decentralized or less than centralized architecture. It focuses like the level of uncertainty down to whether you possess a private key or not, whether you're an issuer, holder, or verifier. So it's very attractive, and you add that in with all the various cryptographic primitives. It's very compelling. It's a new model that enables individuals to present their own proofs, as opposed to have an intermediary that's in between, like an identity service provider that's in the middle of every transaction that you do. So I try to understand the technology enough so that I can just abstract it out of the issues that I have to deal with, which is on the institutional trust. The work that I'm doing with the provinces and territories on behalf of the federal government is onboarding the digital identity programs. And we've onboarded 2 provinces, and the whole assessment process is, do we trust that you actually have a real person, and that person is presenting their real name or their legal name, for that matter, or the name that they use? And when that individual presents themselves to a federal service, do we know it's that person and not someone else? And there's an interplay between the institutional trust and the technical trust, but we've successfully bifurcated the problem that when these new, what I call technological pathways, become available, like we have traditional SAML, OpenID Connect, and when the verifiable credentials come along, we don't have to rethink the entire problem. I'm focused on the institutional trust, and I know that there's these newer technologies, digital wallets, verifiable credentials, that'll come along, and I don't have to reassess the entire program because it's just another pathway. You look at this for digital identity, it applies to more generally, it's a very specific use case for trusting any attributes that are being expressed by an actor or an entity. So as Darrell said, there's a lot of patterns that start presenting themselves over and over again. And you realize the problem, it can be reduced to some like key patterns that we can focus on in building solutions and policy frameworks.
And I'd like to just add a couple things. Tim, you and I years ago, when we were talking about the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework and how you were helping lead some of the digital initiatives, we talked about the onboarding experience. This comes back to assurance, but also trust, because if you don't have assurance and you don't know it's actually me, we have a trust problem. One of the capabilities that we tend to look at in this digital world right now when it comes to digital identity credentials is we want to make it as fast and easy as possible. One of the terms that you used, Tim, in the past was that friction is a feature at times. I want to make sure that if someone's getting in with a real government issued credential, like a level of assurance 3 or higher credential, that it's really them, one, that was onboarded, 2, that is holding that credential, it's still them. When that's known, it becomes a lot easier to do a lot of business. But that process of getting on board is actually quite painful. It involves going to, in Ontario, when it happens, going to a Service Ontario desk or doing some video equivalent. That's hard and painful, but it should be. Because once we enable the digital transactions that are really, really fast, I want to make sure that that anchor of me. Tim, you also used another term just now, which I really like, because I'm tired of hearing, decentralize everything. I'm like, there's always something centralized. It's a question of what dimension, but you used a term I really like, less than centralized, where I really like this term because it means I'm not trying to change the whole freaking world. I'm just putting control points where they really belong. I'm not inserting someone in the middle because I can. There are people and there are centralization points that are there because they belong there. I think that less than centralized phrase is going to be part of my new lingo, dude.
So the challenge that we ran into, like, again, I work for the federal government. We have these legacy systems that have been around for decades, if not like half a century, and or 60 years. And we have to provide a transition path. And like, I used to be on the other side. I know technology. I worked in the software industry. I know what it is to sell the latest and greatest solutions. But oftentimes there's an incremental leap that a lot of institutions simply can't make unless they have to throw everything out. I get it. The disruption's cool and that, but a lot of times with these mission critical national interest systems, you can't do that. Then you actually have to start thinking, well, are there models that can accommodate the legacy approach and enable or embrace the new approach? And the work that we've done with the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework and the policy work, we realized that there was this new model of issuer holder verifier, and of course a verifiable data registry, or whatever you want to call it. We found that we could easily map in the legacy models into that, as well as the newer models. So like SAML, you get like a SAML assertion. Well, what is that? It's basically, you could argue it's a verifiable credential. It's a bunch of data that gets signed. There happens to be an identity service provider in the middle. It's done in real time, but you kind of step back and say, well, that's not really any different than a verifiable credential. Yeah, sure, you got some intermediaries in there, some services in the middle that are doing the plumbing, and the architecture might be centralized or federated. But fundamentally, from a policy point of view, it's exactly the same as whether you're presenting a proof or logging into a system that like redirects you to another system. You realize, from a policy standpoint, they're exactly the same. And then what you do is that you decouple the issues, and it made us realize that what we needed to focus on was, what actually goes into the credential, and have trust in that. And again, I can't go into too much detail, but when we assess a province, it takes us about 6 months to go through their program, like with a fine-tooth comb. And sure, technology figures into the equation, but it's actually understanding the business processes. How do they distinguish individuals? How do they present themselves? What evidence is used? Like where the systems are located? What might be the attacks, etc. And the integration technology, that's a different part of the project. So when they actually integrate, it's like, okay, SAML, big deal. OpenID Connect, big deal. When verifiable credentials come along, we already have have the integrity of, we trust the integrity of the issuer to use the newer language. It just makes
But
it a lot
also,
easier.
Tim, to use your term, the tech can't undermine the institutional and human trust. It needs to support, and it shouldn't drive, but it needs to support, and again, not undermine. Which is, you said something about, it was all tech. I mean, when I first started, I was CTO for multiple companies I founded. I thought tech was going to solve 95% of the world's problems. I'm now utterly upside down on that. I'm pretty sure it's less than 5% of what the tech is going to solve, unless you get the governance, that institutional policy process cover that you really need, which is one of the reasons why I'm one of the funding and founding members of Trust Over IP. Was it separates, much like yours, the concept of institutional human trust and tech. It separates the governance from the tech, but they work together at each layer of that Trust Over IP 4-layer system, which I know you guys are both, certainly more than aware of the Trust Over IP model. But that separation, to me, was the magical moment that occurred in my world, at least, my brain, 5-6 years ago, when it stopped being overly complicated because we were doing things in the wrong place. The separation of that became very, very helpful.
So I would say what the tech does, it changes the equilibrium points. You just have to look through history when introduction of gunpowder changed the nature of warfare, like mathematics change how cathedrals are designed, things like that. And what happens then, that business models and established institutions get upended because now there's alternate ways of doing things better. And so that's what we actually have to understand. Tech is not so much an enabler; it actually just changes the power balance in many respects. And what's happened with SSI and verifiable credentials is there's now an understanding that you don't have to build your own like Uber silo system to be the center of the universe anymore. You're actually part of an ecosystem. So that's the language that we've seen coming into the more common parlance, digital ecosystem, and it's just changing the balance. And people are realizing now, I think it's starting to come to the mainstream, is that you don't have to build like a full capture system to do what you need to do. You can actually rely on other parties to do their bit. And where the magic is making sure that those parties have very specifically circumscribed roles, and they don't creep into something that they shouldn't be. And therein lies the art of the policy. It's not so much about tech.
Yeah, I've taken a few clients through this guideline of must collect everything because I don't trust anybody, through to, wait, I don't need to collect that anymore. It's no longer my poisonous database. I can just take that information that I know from my partner. It's a mental shift that's kind of hard to do. But once it happens, it's really, really quite, it changes the calculus because you're no longer blurring the technical, and to use your term, the institutional side of things. You have a nice way of just dealing. What's the real business problem? How are we solving it?
Yeah, if I can add for identity, like what we're consuming from the provinces and territories, all that we only need 4 attributes. We need an identifier, unique identifier coming from the jurisdiction that's unique within their population, within the province. We need a name, what we call a primary name. We need a date of birth. That's what we agreed on by convention, and we need an assurance level. That's it. We don't need a photo. We don't need gender. We don't need address or anything like that. That's all program specific information. And the programs, if they have the authority to collect that, then fine, they can collect that. But for all intents and purposes of digital identity, those 4 attributes are all that we need to actually match it to the same person that we have on our federal records. That's it.
Yeah.
And I just want to add too, when you start collecting that additional information unnecessarily, like biometric, like facial image, gender, you immediately inject potential for bias in the system. So we just erred on the side of, well, anything that would enable bias, we don't need it. And so that's why we don't collect photo or gender. But that's not to diminish the fact that some programs like driver's licensing or passport, they need that to can administer their program. That's perfectly fine. They can actually request that additional information or collect it. But what we're focused on, making sure you've got the right person, that person is presenting themselves, that person is actually real. And then from that point, you can go into your program authorities to collect whatever you need.
Especially if I'm coming in digitally, that photo is not going to help you because you can't see me anyways. I think the photo in some use cases, we've seen, MDL, mobile driver's licenses, and various different things. They're carrying that because as humans, we're used to comparing something, a picture to the face. But it's becoming less and less important. And as the pattern shifts, we'll get to a point where I don't even need to do that. But it's good to know that on the underlying level, someone's already done the deep thinking that says, you know what, that's not adding to the equation here, especially when we're pure digital. We're not in person. I have no ability to see you. Why do I need a photo?
So in our case, our requirement is that when we get a person come in from a jurisdiction, we got to, so those are provincial level programs, and we have to map it to the same individual in programs that are of national scope. So there's different population. Right. We have a lot of guidance on how to map identifiers, but really the only thing that we need is to be able to match it to the same person. And we've discovered that, a unique identifier, the name, the date of birth, plus some additional checks within the specific programs that they can do is good enough. Again, with biometrics, it's problematic. Like, do you have to collect the raw data or the templates or the probabilistic identifiers? There's a whole bunch of issues around that. But a lot of times those functions actually can be carried out within the province. We don't need to do it. So we just actually realize the benefit of the processes that they've carried out. And this is coming back to, that's what we're trusting. Have you validated the information about the individual? Have you verified it's them presenting themselves? Oh, by the way, you're using like a video chat or video send functionality, or you're relying on the training of an agent to do that determination. That's great. So we've assessed all that. But at the end of the day, when that thing comes across the wire, we know it's the right individual presenting themselves, and we can simply trust that you're providing that to us. We don't need any more information than that.
If I look at Google Trends, which I like to do sometimes to see just how terms are trending over time, I haven't looked, but I'm assuming if we looked on Google Trends for the 2 words trust frameworks, that there may be an upward trend there. I think ourselves being inside of the digital identity space, I feel like every week, at least personally, I'm hearing of a new trust framework or a new thing that's popping up. It seems like there's a big push to monetize the concept of trust today. We've kind of talked a little bit about trust frameworks here and different components of them throughout this conversation so far. But Tim, how would you describe kind of a trust framework, and what are the different types of trust frameworks that you're seeing that are being commercialized, I guess, from a public sector and then also from a private sector?
Oh my goodness, we actually have a definition of a trust framework. I have to dig it up in our policy. I don't have it off the top of my head, but at the end of the day, a trust framework is enabling you to rely on a control over which you don't have direct control. It's, if you boil it down to you're quote unquote trusting, you're relying on something out of your direct observation. That's what it is, and you can apply that to identity trust framework. You can apply that to anything. You're ceding control. You're recognizing that you're not the center of the universe, and tying that back to some of the other language that's evolving. You're part of a digital ecosystem. We spent probably the better part of the decade or longer socializing that concept internally with our federal institutions to say, you can trust the provinces and territories. You don't have to do this stuff all by yourself, or more narrowly, you can trust another province to carry this out on your behalf. You don't have to do everything yourself. You don't have to build your own silo in the sea. I'm mixing metaphors, but you can actually do a whole of government approach. And then you saw the language evolve from whole of government to seamless service to user-centric, no self-sovereign identity. So the center of gravity, if you will, I also call it the locus of control, is kind of moving out of the individual programs, and it's going into the hands of the individuals. And this is where trust frameworks are handy, because it starts codifying those principles, codifying requirements. And it's kind of a precursor to what I would say regulations and legislation, or more formal policy frameworks. The industry has jumped on the term because it's a cool term. It rolls off the tongue well. But at the end of the day, if you look at trust frameworks and what they're trying to do, it's not that different than what you see in the classic conformity assessment schemes. That's one thing that we're discovering in applying this. You can have your high principles, which is great, but then when you get down to doing the assessment, you're trusting and verifying the actors that you're dealing with. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think if you look at it, and you mentioned the dollar values that people are seeing, the future cash that people are seeing. If I look at what's a good example of a technical implementation of trust frameworks that's been around forever, it's credit cards. The reason I'm a huge fan of DHawk, and Visa was initially a kind of a co-op, not technically, but there was kind of this weird do it for the better of the industry and the consumers. Initially, though, it was all about enabling commerce. Why does it work? And if you look at the value of Visa, Amex, MasterCard, Discover, it works because of the following. The banks are able to issue cards, which are going to drive some fees. The customer gets a card that they hold on to. They're the holder in this model. The banks are the issuers. But then you have the merchants who want to get paid, and they want to get paid under a certain set of rules. They're the verifiers here. And the governance authority, the trust framework, the governance framework behind it really is the MasterCard network, the Visa network. I'm certainly old enough, I'm not sure if you are, Mathieu, to know that, when we used to go hunting for ATMs when they were new, you'd pull up and damn, that one doesn't work for me, because there were 4 or 5 different networks. If you went down to the States, it got even worse. It was completely regionalized and localized. What Visa and the value of that Visa network is absolutely immense. Amex is absolutely immense. Why? Because I know that if I follow the rules as a card holder, I can buy something and have a warranty protection and not get screwed by the vendor if there's that kind of a vendor. The merchant, the vendor knows that they can get paid in a certain number of days. Yes, there might be some chargebacks, but they can factor that in their business, as opposed to trying to figure out how to move cash across the country and all that type of thing. And it becomes really, really valuable. That same set of rules, same approach, which to Tim's point on the conformity assessments, come into the digital identity realm. It's just we haven't gotten to the full controls. If you look at Visa, Amex, MasterCard, Discover, all of these card networks, they don't do their own conformity assessments anymore. That's what PCI DSS is for. That's what the SOC 2s are for. They create this framework by which I can come in and say, I am compliant. Please let me in. then I do my paperwork and I'm part of the network. We just haven't gotten there on all of this, the digital identity realm quite yet.
Yeah, if I can add, like history is a good teacher. Like the credit card so went through the crisis. I believe it was in the late 70s, and it was in California where there was a whole crisis, and there was discussion. Let's stop this credit card idea because there was like fraud was rampant. And D Hawk, who is the author of the Chaotic Organization, basically got a bunch of people together. Like they had a workshop over a weekend. They came up with the notion of a chaotic organization. You can just Google it. You'll find the paper. I think it's about 30, 40 years old, that paper. But
yeah, the book One for Many covers it off really, really, really well.
Yeah.
I want to add one thing here that because I work on a global basis, Mathieu and Tim, you're aware of this because I think I've thrown these kudos out many times. It was very interesting for me as a Canadian because we tend to, think of ourselves as, Canadians, and we're this small little country, population wise, massive area wise, but we don't understand the impact we have in some areas. And one area which I was surprised and very pleased to see was that specifically what's called the public sector, I mentioned before, public sector Pan-Canadian Trust Framework has been pointed at and looked at by, I can't tally how many governments at both the national and like provincial state level, but as well as businesses who are looking at how do I start the governance framework, the trust framework work that I need to do? Because if I go deep into the tech, I'm not doing that, as Tim called it, institutional human trust thing, which is where all the value is. That public sector profile of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which is now a national standard underneath the CIO Strategy Council, I'll forget the number, Tim, you probably remember it, is absolutely key to understanding where does this go? How do we build on this framework? And having that, there are countries around the world who are pointing at and thanking Canada for doing that homework.
Yeah, if I can add, like it's a yin and yang contribution, and we've always try to apply what we've learned. Like again, I've been in policy development for years, and you actually have to get out in the trenches and really understand what's going on, and then and kind of step back and reflect and bring that up a level. And as Darrell was saying, Canada is an interesting case study just by virtue of being a federation, a confederation, where there's clear division of powers and authorities. And so we actually had to come up with a model that would accommodate the differences in provinces and Quebec as well. And I think we did a pretty good job of teasing out like the key concepts that can be enacted in policy legislation, but at the end of the day, they can be aligned, and they can actually work together in an emergent way to serve the country as a whole. We're not quite there yet, but I feel like we're well along our way. This is different. Like we're not like a national government that can just like issue legislation and just say, hey, this is a way to do things. It's just that's not how it works in Canada. Other countries, it's not a problem. It just doesn't work that way in Canada. So we've had to accommodate all the differences, the regional differences, differences in how they approach the legislation, and try to come up with a common thread with the trust framework. And as Darrell was saying, we're now starting to codify that via like an accredited standards development organization, the CIO Strategy Council, into a proper standard with a conformity assessment scheme that's underneath that, to align and to make sure everybody's talking the same lingo. But how it gets put into force is really up to the jurisdictions to do it with their own respective legislation and regulations.
So I think that Darrell, you're the one that had recommended the book Chaotic Organizations, which was wonderful, and I'll link it in the show notes if anyone is interested in reading that. I really enjoyed the segments in the book where D refers to his brain as old monkey mind and takes you through kind of what he was thinking at the different points in time. It's a very well written book.
I was fortunate enough to one of my clients actually has D Hawk as an advisor. Which is absolutely magical. He is just a brilliant mind. I think he brings his ideas really bring the best of humanity and solve a lot of the problems. The problem is he's no longer involved in any of the commercials.
Yeah, well, he's on Twitter. If anyone wants to follow D Hawk, he still posts stuff every week or so.
I think our mutual friend John Ainsworth actually put him on Twitter. I'm fairly sure about that.
There you go. And we had John Ainsworth on a previous episode of this podcast, so you could feel free to check that out. I think we talked about D Hawk on there as well. So if we look at the role of kind of, you talk about MasterCard or Visa, and I think Tim, you mentioned a couple of times through this conversation, it's just kind of, you need, I guess, organizations or participants don't need to own the whole thing. They just need to play a role in the ecosystem. And I think that's probably a different way of thinking for a lot of organizations. If we look at MasterCard and Visa, I think it's logical, Darrell, that you're talking about, they're basically governance authorities for payment networks, right? And then the next logical step is moving to identity, which makes quite sense. There's probably a need for large governance authorities, let's say, in the private sector for these ecosystems. If we then look at kind of the financial sector, and I'm always interested in what's going to happen in the financial sector with a lot of the movement that's happening from the public sector side of things. I always wonder the day that verifiable credentials issued directly from either federal or provincial governments or whatever type of government you sit under issue to the citizens, there will probably be a pretty big market to consume these in the private sector. And still under the topic of trust frameworks, I think recently there was an announcement, I know Tim, you had shared this, and I know Darrell, you're familiar with this as well, where the banks are building their own trust framework and seeming to position KYC kind of at the core of identity. What are the banks trying to do with trust frameworks? And I don't know how much you want to delve into this, Tim, and maybe Darrell, this is where you could jump in afterwards, but where do you see this going?
Well, I think various sectors and countries and communities are recognizing that trust frameworks are kind of the game right now. And everyone, governments included, are trying to position themselves to gain the best interest from these trust frameworks. I can be very clear from, again, I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on the government's behalf, but um, I view that our role is to be the issuers of the foundational identity, and also enabling uh, inclusive access to all these critical services that in our context Canadians need, without regard to business model or without regard to means and stuff like that. So I think that's our approach, and that's why we're focusing on like the provinces as being the issuers of the foundational identity. It's a similar thing with financial institutions, just by virtue of them being like a regulated sector. They have to do KYC, which is a very expensive process mandated by the government. And they're seeing an opportunity to actually take that and repurpose that into digital identity. And that's fine for like various commercial sectors. It actually removes some of those friction points that we were talking about earlier. But I guess the fundamental difference is that if the government can provide like a foundational identity to begin with, it should be relatively easy for an individual to open up a bank account. The KYC is already done, as opposed to kind of flipping around saying, "Hey, we've done KYC, then you can get a digital ID." I've been saying, well, you have your digital ID, then you've already got your KYC. So I think there's a huge opportunity for the financial institutions to recognize that what's been a major cost center and point of risk within their organizations. I get it. You might want to turn that into some sort of revenue stream and provide some value-added services, but maybe, what I said earlier, look at yourself in a larger ecosystem, and maybe that's something you don't have to do to begin with. So I think we're just at the beginning of that conversation. The other thing too is that I think we are trying to like remove like the technical architecture assumptions that are oftentimes in these policy frameworks, that you need to have an identity service provider in the middle. It's like, no, you don't. You can actually have a verifiable data registry that everybody has access to. And you can actually achieve this with cryptography. Your device can be your identity service provider with the cryptographic assurances, that technical trust. So there's different ways of like tackling this problem. So that's the other thing, is that I focus on understanding the technologies to tease out what I would call technology assumptions that are kind of assumed to be policy assumptions. And so I think we're at the end of the day, we're just at the beginning of the conversation here.
And I got sort of two divergent and conflicting set of thoughts on this. One is, for a credit union or a bank to stand between me and someone else and say, I am the identity provider, there's two things for me. One, it gives me the feeling of, get out of my shorts. That's none of your business. But it also makes me happy, because there are some relationships that I have that I want to have a regulated party beside me or behind me. I think what they've done is with this approach, this basically federation of federations approach, is the big picture idea is there, that there's value in identity and that financial institutions are a very valuable player in this identity ecosystem. I think what they've done is taken a little bit more of the, like some of they clearly stated in Gain that the reason they did this is they were afraid of being disintermediated, which I don't think is a real fear. I understand that they're afraid of it. They just haven't figured out where the real opportunity is for them to add real value, of which they have a right to extract some of that value if they're adding value to me. But I also, the smart ass in me takes a look at this and says, okay, what is it? Okay, it's a huge open ID federation. It's the mother of all federations. I'm reminded of the movie Spinal Tap, that, and the funny thing is, when you adjust the gain knob on your speakers, the Spinal Tap joke is, well, ours goes to 11, so it's louder. I know, Mathieu, that's kind of lost on you, but there's a nugget of truth there. I'm actually working with some clients, both paid and pro bono, to dig in on where is the real value there. I'm reminded of a very experimental but early stage KYC example. KYC, for those who don't know, is know your customer. It's the data that I am who I say I am, what's my address, my identity documents have been checked out by someone. Where we had a telco providing address information, as is their kind of the authority to a bank. And they nominally say, this costs on an average basis $25 a transaction, is it not like a guesstimate type of fee, because there's so much fake paper, fake plastic out there that they have to have call centers, dedicated lines that says, hey, does Darrell have this account with Telco X? Yes. Oh, no, that's not his account number because they photoshopped it. That's what's happening a lot. But that was to reduce the cost by about 100x down to, measured in pennies, like a quarter or 10 cents type of thing. That's cool. That is a huge financial savings. But when things went really interesting for me was when the telco said to the bank, hey, listen, forget the address information. I don't need that. I'd like to know that Darrell is a customer of you. And by the way, let's exchange how long Darrell's been a customer of us, because that signal alone, they're like, well, hang on a sec. You want to use the same credential? They're like, yeah, you just leave the address blank. They're like, why would you do this? He says, listen, we know the cost. If it costs $25 to determine that Darrell is a customer of Bank X, we're never going to do it. If it's 25 cents, we're going to do it every time. And if Darrell is a long-term customer of yours, we will give Darrell the world. But if Darrell's only been around for 3 days, we have to engage different processes. KYC went upside down. It became, Ainsworth may have said this in his podcast with you, I forget, that know your customer becomes a valuable thing again, not a compliance cost. I've ranted enough on that.
Yeah, if I can add, like the digital identity or trusted digital identity, where it's problematic is that there's no clear business model for it. There's so many externalities, and how people use it is so wide and varied. And it's like, a highway has no clear business model. A toll road does, but sometimes it's not appropriate in the public interest. It's really difficult to fine tune these business models. So, I'm of the view that there has to be something fundamental that serves the public interest, of which then you can actually build the business model. So there is a lot of positioning going on right now. A lot of and that's good. I think there's a lot of policy discussion of like what government needs to do in this new digital ecosystem. I think everybody understands it's, better services, seamless services, less friction, all that good stuff. But the more fundamental discussions are starting. Well, who's actually going to protect your rights within the digital realm? What are your rights in the digital realm? What does that mean? Like, what's sovereignty in the digital realm? What's that mean? What is the digital realm? Like, those questions haven't been really tackled in a good way.
Yeah, and that's an area where I do look to who is going to be my partner, taking care of me, either again beside me or behind me in those interactions. And to me, the credit unions and banks are very, very logical players there. So are the telcos. Because I'm not going to do it myself. I'm just not going to manage that, the consent and all these rules and stuff. There needs to be norms, and someone needs to do that for me because I'm just too busy to do it alone.
Yeah, and if I can add, like in the early days of the pandemic, like in March and April 2020, when we had to get like the emergency benefits out to Canadians, like literally providing like billions of dollars to millions of Canadians, we ran into some like serious friction points that we had to solve. And so you have to take that into account. Yeah, sure, trust your credit union, trust your telco, but in times of emergency and duress, you may have to trust your government. So those are the discussions that have to be had. I don't have the answers. I've got some good opinions, but I don't have the answer on what the policy landscape should look like.
I really like your the analogy of the roads, Tim. I think and people are definitely trying to figure out what the business models are around digital identity based on where they play in the ecosystem. I guess some haven't realized how this ecosystem approach is rapidly changing or forming itself. But I really like the analogy of roads. So roads basically, I'm if I just had to look at that, you're basically, by allowing people to move from point A to point B more efficiently, you're creating more economic activity, I guess, at the end of the day for the country. Just like in the identity example, if you're providing this public service, it kind of has the same outcome downstream. It doesn't have a direct business model, but it has downstream outcomes.
And to extend the analogy, everything doesn't have to be codified in law as well. I don't believe like driving on the right-hand side of the road is actually in law. It's a convention that we've arrived on. Like if a province decides to switch driving on a different side of the road, they probably can do that. But it's not really helpful from a traffic interoperability point of view. Like, so there's conventions, there's rules, there's practices, and a digital identity and trust frameworks are no different than what we've done historically.
All right, so just to close this conversation, with more and more government digital ID and self-sovereign ID initiatives coming from the public sector, I think we're really seeing the importance of, especially that this is a public service and governments are really pushing for self-sovereignty. And Darrell, in the past days, we had been talking about this, of just why open source is so important for digital sovereignty. Maybe you just want to comment on that, Darrell, and then it would be good to hear from you, Tim, to close the conversation here of why open source is kind of the only way to go for the future of what we're doing.
Yeah, to use the analogy that Tim used of roads and stuff, there are very few private roads. I mean, even where we live, yes, there are some toll roads, but some of them are owned by the province. Some of them are owned in a private equity place, which was a huge mistake. Huge revenues on that one. The issue with open source is that, one, the digital identity world, the standards, we're in what I call a premature standardization and premature interoperability stage. We don't have all of the answers yet. The standards and specifications are not as rigid, and they won't be because we're still figuring things out. But on one of the funny issues about SSI, self-sovereign identity, is a lot of government people flinch when we hear that phrase, because the term self-sovereign, one thinks of people in the militia up in the hills with guns and whatnot. But an interesting trend that I'm hearing repeatedly, just even last week at the UN General Assembly, where the following phrase was said, is that nations need to consider their digital sovereignty. How does one ensure that the nation state itself is in control of some of those key rails? In Canada, created legislation, and we have groups like Interact that were created out of legislation to handle the rails. Yes, it's all private right now, but there's government regulation and oversight. On the digital identity side, we need to start forming that. And what governments are now doing, government of the UK government has a really good page on this. I can send you a link for it. It explains why do you go open source. We're at a stage where you can't, either by intent or by either a sin of omission or commission, you don't want to be tied to a particular vendor that may or may not, one, be appropriate, two, may not want to long-term support things. And if we don't get digital identity right, we're in deep trouble, which is why a lot of there's government initiatives right now in Canada, at other national level and regional, provincial, state levels that are doing very similar things. They're adopting a particular technology stack, but aiming towards the full interop that's going to be required to serve their citizens. That is allowing the country to establish its own digital sovereignty and doing really the same things we've been doing for decades or longer, hundreds of centuries. Let me as an individual, carry my stuff around. That's all.
Yeah, I guess like open source or open standards is really important because there's a couple of issues at play here. You want to encourage like a competitive marketplace, and by doing it in an open way, you can openly compete. And another big issue is supply chain integrity, like proprietary software or a single implementation of something. You don't know whether it's if you can trust it or not, and that's another issue, is that when you're using software, it might have like 900 dependencies on components that are out there, and you don't know what's malicious. And so there's a whole supply chain integrity issue there. And also, it gives the opportunity for like independent reference implementations. Then it really forces the issues around the standards, because oftentimes when you're standardizing and you're only looking at from your implementation point of view, you might not be considering some other issues. So it actually creates some more robust standards that accounts for different perspectives. So I think it's the way to go. I think the days of proprietary software are like gone.
Just you and I have talked, I think we probably all talked about this, but in the late 90s, I'm showing my age, in early thousands, we were involved in an initiative that was initially led by Canada, by NRCan and DND, Department of National Defense, in the geospatial space about imagery and map data. Back then, to give you an idea, it became a national and now a global level initiative called opengeospatial.org or opengis.org. But what we broke was the pattern that vendors at that point in time, specifically the imagery and vector data vendors, had a lock on the market. To give you where did we end up? Back then, if I wanted to get imagery of a particular place, let's say my brother's cottage up in Wyerton that, Tim, I think you biked by the other day. I saw that on LinkedIn, which please do share that on LinkedIn. People need a little more humanity. If I wanted good imagery of his place, that would have cost me $25,000. Today, I zoom in on Google. It's free. The data have been completely freed. That's where digital identity will end up, with very, very minor rail costs. In the meantime, there's going to be huge business built on top of the reliability of it. And those people who build those rails over time will hopefully, do well, but both for themselves as well as the rest of us.
Yeah, if I can add, like, we have to keep an eye on the long term. In the long term, like anything that's systemic, trends to one, meaning there will only be one option, like the internet, for example, and the costs trend to zero. And that's a fact of life. Whether it happens in the next 5 years, 15 years, 20 years, that's something that we have to keep an eye on the trajectory. And I think Darrell just gave an awesome example of the geospatial systems where they were fragmented and very costly, but now you can get it free. And business models that were totally unanticipated are built on that, and then capabilities completely unanticipated, like Uber and Airbnb, like all the mapping, like nobody thought of those things in the 90s. So we have to keep an eye for the next level of opportunities that we don't even know what they are.
Yeah, just a closing comment. The interoperability was key. We did a military test of taking the open Canadian data and the open US data and tried to do some routing between Detroit and Windsor, and they went via Seattle, Vancouver, Bellingham, Washington area, because the roads didn't actually connect.
All All right. Thank you guys so much for doing this. This was a phenomenal conversation. I'm sure people are going to get a lot of enjoyment out of this. And I will be asking the two of you, I'm sure, for a part 2 in the near future.
Awesome.
Thanks for
Really
having
appreciate
us.
it.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.